Todd, Todd. If you're not connected to audio yet, I don't know if he's connected.
There
There
it
you
is.
Hey, your uh, your beard could very easily be like a Luciferian type beard. You just need to
Cool.
like a little bit pointier, you know?
Uh-huh. Well, I could work on that.
I
I
think
like how we've got this full gradient of facial hair going on, where
Mhm.
you've got the full beard up there, and then
Yeah.
Todd's got the goatee, and then I can't have facial hair right now.
I should have kept it because it was a little bit. It was pretty thick.
Yeah. I've slowly been letting it grow out a little bit. Trimming still, but with longer length each time. So just experimenting. Not even really for lockdown reasons, because yeah, I still go to work anyway, and no one cares.
I was growing mine a little bit for lockdown reasons, and then Dan was like, just shave it. So then I just shaved it, and I always would have to shave it every time I went into work anyway, so it doesn't make that big a difference. But.
Yeah. So that is, yeah. Let's see. So Jared, we got a busy day today.
Yeah. So we need because
I think we have some kayaks for you, by the way. Were you going to be renting?
if you have kayaks for us, then that's the preference. But
I'll double check. I'm pretty sure we do.
Okay.
And I think it's. I don't think anyone else was joining. Are you bringing anyone else?
I think Aaron wants to join. I'm not entirely sure.
Well, I kind of assumed Aaron was coming. But,
Yeah.
So, but I mean, either way. Cool. So how you all been? What did I miss? Sorry, I was a little bit late. Did you get into anything before I joined?
We unraveled most of the mysteries of the universe, I would say.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Or at least of love.
Of love. Oh.
Yeah.
You had a symposium going on?
We were talking about my wife and Jack's boyfriend.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the proper term? Or do you call each other boyfriend?
Yeah. Yep.
That we are very much complementary and different.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll let Jack explain his situation. But my wife is very different from me in many different ways. But I'm a very analytical person. Like I prioritize rationality, and that I probably relate much better and am more similar to many atheists than I am to Mormons.
Okay.
Whereas my wife is much more emotional, much more socially aware, vastly more socially aware, I would say. And I was just telling Jack, every once in a while, I'm working through something in my mind. So I was working through signaling theory, just this idea that, basically everything we do is for the benefit of other people rather than ourselves. And it took me a full year to work through that because I was like, I don't want to do anything because I want to make sure that I'm doing it for the right reasons. And whereas my wife, she was just like, well, of course, that's how some things are. And that's how it should be, and you just need to get over it. I was like, oh, so you were just born with that. You just naturally understood that some things are signaling, like picking your favorite movie, that's a form of signaling.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I was really trying to figure out what is the movie that really speaks to me. She's like, no, you kind of just pick the movie that you want to portray to other people. It's like she was just born that way, and I was like, wow, so different than me.
Mm-hmm. And that's not really, then that's not a problem even. Because I can see feeling that is inauthentic, but then inauthentic to what? Maybe there's not too much to be inauthentic to, because a lot of our individuality or a lot of our personality is external to our own bodies. It's social as well.
So here's the test then, to see how well you've learned that lesson, Jared. What's your favorite movie?
Ooh,
Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring.
that's a good one.
Um,
I affirm your choice.
Series, and then Jurassic Park. First
What was the
Jurassic.
middle one? Sorry.
So I'll pick Fellowship of the Ring as my favorite of the Lord of the Rings, but all three, the trilogy, are my favorites. And then as a second, I will choose Jurassic Park.
Mm-hmm. By the way, that article on Lord of the Rings, I was kind of browsing through it, and I kind of getting into the improbability of that trilogy being made and all that. Was there something about like how it would have been made differently today and why it would have been worse later on in the article? I didn't find that part, or was it just about the improbability of it? Or did you guys read it?
I read it. I didn't read it so deeply that I can cite it back to you.
I was kind of looking for like a criticism of movies like now, or like how it would have turned out horrible for such and such a reason, and this is what it would have been like, and all that. I didn't see that, but not that I needed that, but that's or not that that's required.
Superheroes, right? And like superhero movies, and that probably would have been more in that vein. It probably would have been more MCU, right, than what it was. And I don't know if that's true, but it's definitely true that the movie was, or the movies were incredibly unlikely to have happened, incredibly unlikely to have been as well directed and filmed as they were, to be as serious and spiritual and just the scale of it, like all of that was so incredibly unlikely.
Yeah. Well, and I actually do remember reading that at the time. I think it was in between Two Towers and Return of the King when they were coming out. I was reading an article about that and how it was such a gamble for New Line Cinema to put Peter Jackson at the lead, put all that money out up front. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah,
I do even remember at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it was like a budget 10 times bigger than anything Peter Jackson had ever done. He had never filmed like a 3-part movie before. I mean, he had done nothing even remotely like Lord of the Rings before.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. It was a gamble in so many ways.
And I think the same applies to Howard Shore, the composer for the music. I don't think he had done anything of that scale or even genre, really. I remember that on the Soundtracks podcast. What's it called again? Maybe that's what it is, Soundtracks podcast. But that Howard Shore had done a lot of like kind of just boilerplate soundtracks for movies that, not like on an epic scale or anything, just kind of like comedies or family movies. But was just a real Lord of the Rings fan, and then produced what I think is quite a critically acclaimed soundtrack. I mean, I certainly enjoy it, and I think so. Like, even in modern concert music, there's a little bit of debate over how film soundtracks fit into that, but there seems to be some type of agreement that Lord of the Rings kind of breaches the divide, if there is one. That it's just a very, very, very good soundtrack.
But everything about those movies just blows me away every time. Rewatch every year.
Have you read the books?
Yeah.
Have you read them, Jack?
I have.
Okay.
Yes. It has been a while, but yes.
I haven't yet. But I was wondering, like, if the movies are better than the books in some ways. So I'll ask you guys what you think, because I haven't read them.
So here's my not a huge fan of the series take, like a respecter of what it's done, but have ever been super drawn to it. The way the books feel is less like what you'd expect from a contemporary fantasy novel and more what you'd expect from sort of a narrative history, almost like the Book of Mormon is a closer analogy than I'd give than a standard fantasy novel, in the sense of, for example, the battles are written in this very like historian, then the people did this sense. versus, and then he swung his sword, and then this clash, and then this clash, and such. And yeah, it's not a perfect comparison, but that's the main way I think of the Lord of the Rings. Is it's sort of like reading a history book if the history book is of a fantasy setting, and gets a little more into the narrative than that. But that's the feeling I get. And the movies end up taking that and making it just more this standard, like, here are all the adventure-y things that were being talked about in this book. So yeah, the movies have much more a standard fantasy feel, I would say, than the books. So it depends on what someone is looking for in them.
Yeah, probably more like Beowulf, and so, like ancient legends, which are like, anytime you read an old legend, it's not like a contemporary fantasy novel where they're talking about the sword play or anything very explicit and those small details of the battle or anything like that. So it's a little bit broader picture, and the characters are more noble, almost like, rather than being real dialogue, it's someone remembering after the fact and making the language even more flowery than it would have been at the time.
Yeah, interesting.
And there's so many songs. So many songs. It's ridiculous. And the names are so hard to remember. and you kind of lose track. And there's portions of the book, specifically Tom Bombadil, that you're just like, why would anyone write this? But because for Tolkien, it wasn't, it wasn't like he was telling this story about characters. He was telling the story about the world. Like, Middle Earth is the character. Like, it's really a story about Middle Earth. And so he tries to sneak in all of these things, and he understands literature enough that he doesn't overdo it, but sometimes he's pushing the limits.
Okay.
Yeah. It's good. It's an incredibly religious work. It's an incredibly personal work in that it's inspired a lot by his time in World War One. There's a book called what is it?
A Hobbit, a Wardrobe,
and a Great War. Yeah. A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. It's about the relationship between C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who were good friends. J.R.R. Tolkien, incredibly Catholic, actually converted C.S. Lewis, who was atheist at the time, or at least was part of his conversion process. And they had this very interesting relationship, and they were both writing these very fantastical books at the time, as part of a group they called the Inklings. And both of these books are about religion and their time in the war and their worldview. And I highly recommend the book. But the works are fundamentally symbolic in so many ways, rather than this purely like just a great story that I'm writing just because it's a great story. There's so much meaning behind it all.
Yeah. I have read that book, by the way. I really enjoyed it, especially the early portion about C.S. Lewis's conversion and the late night conversations. That was very interesting.
Yep. Kayla just read it too, so maybe we need to have a conversation, the three of us.
Yeah. Oh, who just read it? Sorry?
Kayla.
Oh, okay. Great. And what was the book by Orson Scott Card that you just read?
The Gate Thief.
The Gate Thief. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to try that one out.
Incredibly Mormon. It's classical,
right.
Sneaking in Mormon theology wherever he can.
Well, I think that's kind of interesting. Yeah. So I think you draw on what your it can be very powerful to draw on your own culture and the stories from it, right? It seems like so I think of what's the name of the guy? There's the guy who wrote the story of a part-time Indian. But anyway, he draws on Native American his Native American heritage, or people in the magical realist school drawing on their background in their Latin American culture, and that, okay, so what is a Mormon literature? It's not necessarily something that is explicit. It doesn't even have to be religious or anything, but maybe draws on ideas and imports them into the story. So I see him as kind of an example of that. I think he has written some books that are religious too. Like, I think he's written some books about Old Testament women, like did he do Rebecca and Esther and stuff like that? But yeah, even in his sci-fi novels, you can tell he's kind of drawing on this cosmology, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's what J.R.R. Tolkien does, right? So if you've read the Silmarillion, or all you have to do is read the first chapter of the Silmarillion, and it's this creation story, and God or Eru is singing this song, and through his song, like, the angels are singing with him, and their music is building something, but the angels don't have like the creation story is this very beautifully written, and I love it, but it's very Catholic. There's some extra elements in there, but like, you understand, like, the music isn't literal music; it's symbolism for something much stranger, something much more beyond our understanding.
Is this Tolkien you're talking about?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
Silmarillion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, it's very Catholic, something not explicitly, but in that, he's very much drawing from the theology and the themes, and Card does the same thing. I feel like Card hits you a little bit more over the head with it than Tolkien does, but maybe that's because I am Mormon and I'm not Catholic, and so I don't quite appreciate the full extent to which it is Catholic.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd say it also depends on the book by Card. Like, he had his whole series that was basically Book of Mormon retold and everything. Mm-hmm. And then he has other things that are just, passively inspired by his culture. It's really interesting to me just how many really high-profile Mormon authors there are in that, like, broader fantasy sci-fi-ish sphere. Mm-hmm. Like, you've got Brandon Sanderson, you've got Card, you've got, even Stephanie Meyer, for example, and you've got a few other reasonably high-profile people forming this sort of Mormon sphere of fiction. I know I didn't really see it myself, but I know a bunch of other people have pointed out, like, here's this and this Mormon influence in, say, the cosmology of Brandon Sanderson's work and stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, it is interesting the way Mormon culture influences that little side of fiction.
It's an interesting topic, and it kind of touches on a few things. So I remember reading an article, I think it was a blog post a number of years ago, it was talking about it, precisely that there are a lot of Mormon authors in sci-fi and fantasy, but kind of I guess wondering, why aren't there Mormon authors in real literature? Which touches on the other question of is science fiction and fantasy literary? And I listened to a course on science fiction, and that was, the opening lecture, right? Is science fiction something that we should take seriously in literature? And, this guy studies it, so, he was making the case that it is. But I know there's that whole debate, which is a general aesthetics debate. I see no reason to exclude it. I mean, it's just it's its own genre. Whether it's obviously a different type of thing than something you would get with Ulysses or Dostoevsky or Don Quixote. Well, maybe a little. Don Quixote is kind of crazy, but yeah, I think I don't see any problem with that, really. It is interesting to think, why is that the case specifically? Why science fiction and fantasy has been so fruitful for Mormon authors? I don't really have an answer to that, but I definitely see there's a big footprint there.
That's a good question. There are multiple different threads of conversation going on there. So
mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
I may respond going back a little bit first. It's funny that Jack mentioned the three authors, and they're like the only three authors I can think of that are Mormon: Orson Scott Card, Brandon Sanderson, and Stephanie Meyer. I don't know any other Mormon authors.
But they're big, right? I mean, Orson Scott Card's pretty dominating, and
yeah, and Brandon Sanderson is really taking over the fantasy scene.
Yeah,
maybe one of the biggest names right now.
You've got other ones like, I think James Dashner is Mormon, and he had some high-profile young adult ones. The Fablehaven guy, especially young adult. Yeah, young adult seems to have quite a few.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not familiar with them. But what's interesting is that both Brandon Sanderson and Orson Scott Card, like, I love their books. Like, I like fantasy and I like sci-fi, but I'm not like a huge fan where it's like, I'm reading, many books every year. And like most, like, I'm very unfamiliar with most sci-fi and fantasy. But Speaker for the Dead, Orson Scott Card's sequel to Ender's Game, like, that one really spoke to me as a teenager, where it, like, I don't know if it would be right to say it changed the course of my life, but that might not be too far from the truth, where it really deeply influenced me. And I think part of it was like, here was this Mormon author who was pulling on Mormon values and Mormon themes, but through agnostic characters.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, I was going through an agnostic phase, trying to figure everything out, becoming atheist, and being able to realize, like, oh, like, I can still hold these values even as I leave God behind. Like, that was really formative for me, and really helped me understand, like, who is it that I want to be as a person? And like, and there was like this, semi-godlike character that I was like, wow, like, that's the kind of person I want to be. It's like incredibly empathetic, but also like fatherly, and like all of these attributes. I was like, wow, I really want that. And then later I read Brandon Sanderson. I read the Mistborn trilogy, and like, it's so good. It's an amazing trilogy. Didn't quite speak to me the same way that Speaker of the Dead did, but I can't help but thinking, like, did he do the same thing that Orson Scott Card did? Is that why I find this so appealing, that he's pulling on these Mormon themes? That's why it's specifically to me, this is really like pulling me in. I don't have enough experience with fantasy and sci-fi to know, but I feel like their Mormonism is implicit in so many ways that it like just really draws me in, and that I'm Mormon. My Mormon heritage just like makes me understand those books in a different way than I think other readers might.
Mm-hmm. See, that even makes me think, even beyond that, in a different direction with, say, music. For a while, I've noticed and been amused by just how many bands I enjoy happen to have also Mormon ties. You've got Imagine Dragons, you've got The Killers, you've got Neon Trees, you've got some fairly big name bands. I mean, the Piano Guys and such. These groups that have gained a lot of prominence that I'm not sure whether I was exposed to them because and appreciated them because it's just, you're in the area, this is the sort of thing that happens, or because they're really good music, or whether there is some sort of cultural connection of, some thread that runs through it. But definitely in music and in fiction, a disproportionate amount of groups or creators that I enjoy have been within that Mormon framework.
Once again, you named the exact three that I was thinking of.
Well, yeah, it brings up an interesting question too of like how much of aesthetics is cultural, because maybe within our sphere of influence, those are the things that because of our backgrounds and tastes that have developed, we find certain things. First we're exposed to them, and then also find them appealing. So, like, I keep bringing up Kant's subjective universal on aesthetics. I don't know about the universal part, but maybe well, I guess it'd be the complete opposite, subjective relativist, right? But or subjective cultural, that our tastes are kind of developed by the background we're in. So maybe in this a Mormon cultural milieu, there's a reason that those end up being so prominent.
I think there has to be a little bit of both going on. There's a famous experiment in psychology where they had people listen to music, and then they figured out, okay, well, most people kind of gravitated to the third song on this, of these 12 songs. They gravitated to song number 3. Then they took a different group and they said, the last group preferred song number 12. And even though that number 12 had been low, like not a lot of people preferred that song number 12 in the first group, the second group is like, oh, wow, yeah, song 12, that's the best on this track, right? And so people gravitated towards what other people were saying. Other people like this? Oh, wow, then it must be good. And wow, I'm listening to it and I like it. So that there has to be this kind of subjective aspect to it. I used to be very critical of people's like of music, where it's like, you just like it because other people like it. But maybe that's not so bad. This is something my wife probably understood before I did, where I'm like, yeah, you have to like the music out of some authentic place of like just speak deep to you. And she's like, no, you just like, what other people like you relate to people through those things, and so you should like them. In fact, I know that's what she likes. She watches TV shows she doesn't even really care for, so that she can communicate.
To talk about them with other people.
Talk about them.
Right.
Yeah.
That's actually some what I was thinking when you were saying that is, for so long in my own life, I was such an entertainment hipster where I was like, I have all these incredibly obscure, very, very niche interests and passions and such. And then I'm going around and looking at everyone and like, oh my gosh, you all like the same few boring things. And then I'm looking a little bit more and I'm like, and I'm the one who doesn't have anything to talk about with anyone because I refuse to like the things that everyone likes because everyone likes them. And I'm like, okay, so realistically, if you're looking at this from a detached point of view, it is strictly advantageous to like things that a bunch of other people like. Well, I said strictly. Let me back up. I'll say, so there's one major advantage, which is suddenly you can talk about these things with everyone. I'll then say the advantage that I then realized or properly started grasping of really focusing in on some niches is if you are really passionate about some things that a bunch of people are overlooking, it gives you angles of attack, angles of discussion, angles of approach that other people are surprised by, and you can become interesting in that way. So I think there's a really intriguing balance between liking and appreciating things that everyone in whatever circle likes, appreciates, understands, and then drawing in and finding here are these other things that I understand the interesting thing in, and therefore can make interesting for other people.
The other part of that this is reminding me of is that conversation we've had about, I think it's a Bertrand Russell quote about strawberries. It's like, there's nothing, Todd, do you remember the quote?
I can paraphrase it. Yeah, it's there's nothing wrong with not liking strawberries, but if you don't like strawberries, then you're missing out on a pleasure that people who do like strawberries get to enjoy.
Yeah. So like, if given the choice of liking something and not liking something, why would you choose not to like something?
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can just experience more value. Like that's all it is. Like, you have one more extra thing in the world which brings you value. So like, expand your interest as far as possible. And we are specifically talking about this in terms of bisexuality, in case you
yes,
would expand your sexual interests. I applied the Decker rule to that. I say, if it doesn't, enhance your love of your spouse or your significant other, no. But otherwise, sure, why not?
That's funny. Yeah, I was thinking about the like the ultra serialist school of music. I could see how people could get into that, especially for, okay, so we're coming up on 10 minutes. What we'll do is we'll start another meeting. But anyway, we'll finish this one out. I could see how people in an academic setting where that's like the thing, and there's definitely a system built up around it. There were, people pushing new lines and doctrines, and I could see how people could really get into that. Even though, like in the back of Steven Pinker's book, how he has appendices. Sorry, I should say which book. Blank Slate. He has an appendix about like universal values, that things that people value in every culture, and he has a chapter on the arts and how academic arts are alienating to regular people because they don't touch into the senses, artistic senses that people naturally have, regardless of any of that. I think like ultra serialism, okay, most people when they hear that are probably not going to like it very much. So there's something to that, right? Okay, that's not a natural taste that people have. But some people really did get into it. And probably a big social aspect of that, right? I could see people sitting around listening to Boulet's piece and being like, oh, wow, look what he did there, and how he used, those integers. And, I'm not fluent enough in ultra serialism to be able to parody it. But I could see how they could really get into it and develop what I would consider a still genuine aesthetic appreciation for it.
A few things come to mind in response to that. A couple of them, how familiar are you guys with various XKCD comics? For example, if I refer obliquely to a couple of them, will you? So there are two XKCD comics. One talking about people trapped in a room with pictures of Joe Biden eating sandwiches.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they come up with all these rankings of that. And then there's another about the divisions within the plastic crazy straw design world. The ones between, where
I haven't seen that one.
That one's talking about like basically the idea that human subcultures are nested fractally, that you can go really deep in and never always find new random things that people get very, very deep into. And then the other thing that comes to mind is the recent video that I shared on the forum talking about, or showing this guy playing Sudoku and doing the Sudoku puzzle and explaining his thought process with this puzzle as he went through, and getting incredibly excited about this Sudoku puzzle. Where I'm going at with all of these basically is that I think it is possible in almost anything to start getting deep into them. But once you get deep into those things, I think there are some universal factors within them that appeal to people about them. Like, it's not random once you get in. And even from the outside, if it's explained right, you can understand the universal appeal behind something. So those Sudoku videos, for example, I think are phenomenally successful because this guy is so very good at explaining the reason he feels passion about it, at demonstrating in a way people can feel the positive side of it, where he suddenly sees all these beautiful connections within it and these beautiful patterns, and he notices these clever tricks and this clever element of construction in it, something that someone who's just like trying to fill out a bunch of random freaking numbers won't understand. And the relevance, I think, is that there is, you get into these really obscure, really niche genres, whatever, and the surface dressing is not necessarily going to be appealing. But if you are determined and if you want to find something appealing in it, there will still be universally intriguing things if you dig deep enough, and things that someone who exposes it in the right light can be like, see, these things, these elements of the human experience that you like and you value are visible and apparent within this thing in ways that do take a little bit more digging than just being immediately apparent to the naked eye. And that's what I think applies to a lot of subcultures. Even pictures of Joe Biden eating a sandwich, like, you could get all of those and you would still find legitimate things to differentiate them and legitimate values within almost anything.
So let me question you on that one. So you're talking about things that might be universally appealing. So we can talk about Joe Biden eating sandwiches, right? Like, I can imagine two cultures forming around that particular art aesthetic, right? And I can imagine them coming to the exact opposite conclusion on every picture.
Yes.
Would you agree that that's a possibility?
Absolutely, yes.
So how fine a grain of detail do you have to go before you find that actual absolute, right? Because anytime two people disagree, you could just say, oh, it's because they're actually two different subcultures. So where does that absolute actually come through?
Well, the question would be, what are they focusing on? I've found so many times with disagreements that it's not literally, you see this thing and it is bad because of this exact reason, and the other person sees that thing and it is good for that exact same reason. Yeah, thanks. But rather, like, you see this thing and it is good for this reason and bad for these few reasons, and the other person sees that thing and they draw they focus on a completely different area of it. I feel like it would be really useful for me to come up with a proper example here, but the only example that I'm thinking of, I would rather not say out loud at the moment. So,
we'll just imagine. That's funny.
Yeah, but really, I think I've tried really, really hard to disagree with people sometimes. Like, when I worked on an adversarial collaboration, we clearly had some high-level disagreements, and you get down to the specifics, and we tried really, really hard to disagree. And every time we zoomed in, we were like, well, yeah, this makes sense, this makes sense, this makes sense. You zoom out a bit, and suddenly the high-level disagreements pop back in. You zoom in, agreement on pretty much all the facts. You can figure out this, figure out this, figure out this. You spend hours and hours getting all the details out, zoom back out, and you realize that it's simply a difference of priorities. Not a difference of, oh, this thing that you value is bad, but like, but why do you care about that versus, so yeah, I would say basically there's just more of a difference of focus between which value you hold more versus a difference of one person says red is green, if that makes sense.
This reminds me.
Let's pause there for a second. I think we're coming up on the end of this one. Let's end this one. We'll take a little break, and I'll send out another link, and we'll restart. So hold that thought, Jared. All right. We'll see ya.
Bye.
Hello again.
Hey, you guys look familiar.
All right. I should have like a commercial break in between those two. I need a sponsor or something. And now a word about Squarespace.
Crazy straws.
All right. So our last recording session is downloading right now. So it looks like it lets us do both at once. So, okay, Jared, what were you going to say?
We ended on Jack's note about finding the disagreement, and sometimes it's very difficult. You zoom out and you're like, yeah, we disagree, and you try and zoom in on exactly where that disagreement is, and there isn't a disagreement. And you zoom out again and there is, and you're like, how is it that we're even disagreeing? Which reminds me of 3 different conversations we've had recently.
Mm-hmm.
One is effective altruism. One is about the current riots going on in Minnesota. And the third, I've forgotten what it was. I'll stick to the first 2. in both of those cases, it was almost like we were asking. Oh, the third is Alex's point about finding what one should do in the world, like how to make a difference.
Oh, yeah.
So in the first two, in effective altruism, me and Jack sometimes seem to disagree, but we're not sure if we actually do disagree. And then with the riots going on, Johnny and Jack seem to disagree with me, but it's not quite clear if we actually do disagree. And in both cases, I think it's almost more about the role one thinks that they should personally play versus what should be done at a more global or national scale. So with effective altruism, it's like, I think that personally I should be involved in something like that, where it's, trying to do really effective, good changes in the world rather than focusing on small things. And I'm not sure if I'm going to characterize this right. I might make you into a straw man, Jack. You want to clarify your position on it?
It's a good thing he's here, so.
Straw man me first, and then I'll edit it.
Jack doesn't care about people.
Okay.
No, this is how I'll characterize it. I haven't figured out how I'll characterize it. I'll speak while I'm figuring it out. I think one should focus on how one personally can do the most good in the world, while also thinking about their own strengths, what fits them, basically. So I'm not doing malaria nets because I don't think that's where I can do the most good. I think there's an aspect of fit to it that one should focus on. But I do think effective altruism is generally the right approach, and much more people need to be doing it. But I don't think that everyone in the world should be focusing on effective altruism. And I think Jack thinks of himself in that latter group. He doesn't need to be the person doing effective altruism because not everyone does need to do it. But me, since I am aware of it, because I understand the logic behind it, I think that I should be. I don't know. How would I do?
Yeah. So I think that the concept of effective altruism and the effective altruism movement are important to separate from each other. And I think fundamentally the idea that you should figure out the way that you personally can do the most good in the world is a fantastic focus and an excellent idea. I also think that the effective altruism movement is characterized by several quirks and several, I would say,
certain personality types.
Certain ideological frameworks that I would disagree with, and to the point where I am somewhat convinced that my own most effective altruistic path is largely disconnected from the movement of effective altruism itself. Not wholly, but partially disconnected from them. And one specific area I would highlight as a disagreement is the concept of whether all people having equal moral value indicates that you should have equal moral concern yourself for all people and equal responsibility towards them. And Peter Singer in particular, and the effective altruism movement more broadly, would say, no, you should absolutely not prioritize anyone. Like, your concern should be towards everyone because they have equal moral value. Whereas I would say that people should significantly prioritize the people closest to them by various metrics, even acknowledging that everyone has equal moral value. So the phrase Newtonian ethics comes up. where the idea of people have higher ethical concern the closer they are to you. And effective altruism as a movement says, no, absolutely that's ridiculous. And I say, no, I think that it is actually appropriate to prioritize those close to you by various metrics. And my own straw man of the effective altruism viewpoint there would be, and this is clearly a straw man or reductio, but the idea of everyone at all times, going the torch versus dust specs route, everyone at all times trying to equally divide their income and their effort to help every other person in the world, to the extent of parents don't help their kids, they're just spending a little bit of effort on everyone, and people ignore their communities altogether and just spend a little bit of effort on everyone, where I think everyone ends up being better off with the understanding, as long as you don't let people fall through whatever net of connections, with the understanding of it is valuable to find and then help people who are closer to your sphere of influence and focus in on a limited sphere where parents do help their children, people do build their community, people do find some interests and gravitate towards those interests and work within that sphere. People don't have just some generalized broad concern for everyone's welfare exclusively.
Yeah, so the question is fundamentally about who one has responsibility for. Do you have responsibility for people distant from you in time or space? And or is your responsibility about those close to you temporally and spatially? I would say that there's actually, the truth is somewhere a little bit in the middle, in that, yes, you do have moral responsibility for people in your community. So part of the concern with the Minnesota, part of our disagreement there is like, I don't feel responsible for the riots in any way or for that community. Like this is a Black community in Minnesota. Like, this is nothing like it's so distant from anything I'm even familiar with.
Sorry to interrupt, but to personalize that for a moment, the riots also extended into Omaha. No riots, but there were protests. I actually had the choice of driving 15 minutes over and participating in a protest, which actually I'm not allowed to do by the military, but it became something much closer to home. But anyway, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
And if I were in Philadelphia, I would have had the opportunity to. And in fact, even here in Phoenix, there were protests. So I'm perhaps exaggerating a bit, but like I don't know. It's just so. I grew up in the Mormon sphere, and like that sphere of influence is so far away from me that I don't feel that I have any responsibility for it. So that's probably why I just don't feel anything. Like I don't feel that much emotion over the riots in the same way that I don't feel much emotion over like uncontacted tribes in Brazil. Like, I know they're doing crazy things, and I know they're like raping their wives and killing each other and stuff. And it's like, yeah, but what does that have to do with me in some ways, right? It's just such a different community. Whereas I do feel a responsibility towards changing the police system because I'm an American citizen, and like that's where my influence can and should be, right? So again, it's this idea of like, where is my responsibility? Where is my personal responsibility in both these cases? And with effective altruism, it's like, yes, you should have some responsibility with people in your immediate sphere of influence. But I think some people are called or inspired to, and when I say called, I don't necessarily mean religious, but you can take it in that way, to do something somewhere else, to focus on, people in a different continent, different country, people very different from them, like missions, because of my mission, I have a particularly strong attachment to Chiapas, Mexico, and like I if someone offered me an opportunity to do something down there, like I would take it in an instant, because like I love those people so much. and like that's just like an accident of history in many ways. But like I feel an attachment. There's something there that connects me to them that makes me feel not necessarily responsible for them, but like I want to do something. And I'm not sure if I'm articulating this quite right, but this is what I think unites all of these disagreements. Is it's not necessarily so much about a disagreement about beliefs or about values, but about personally, what is my role in all of this?
Yes. And I would say, don't you think that, say, that community that you happen to go to on your mission, that is an extension of the care about people you are, or care about groups you are proximate to, in the sense of, yes, it's by random chance, and they're far, far away geographically, but you are proximate to them in the sense of you happened to go there and get a bunch of personal exposure and personal experience there, and purely by that chance, suddenly they are closer within your sphere of responsibility. And people who do choose to go to different countries and do incredible work there, I mean, someone like Mother Teresa comes to mind. I think that there is a sense of chance to it and a sense of randomness, but by making it proximate, she made it her responsibility, basically. And I think there's definitely a place for people making things that are geographically distant their responsibilities. But I don't think it's an expression of generalized concern for everyone that prompts them to do that, so much as a decision to make one other set of people more proximate to them, if that makes sense, if that distinction.
Yeah, and there's multiple things going on. How one decides whom one should serve, in what ways, like that's an incredibly personal decision that there isn't, I wouldn't say that there's a single coherent framework for making that decision. Like everyone is going to have a different framework for how they come to that conclusion. And effective altruism, like we should all have equal value. And the framework is something like, I can't remember the criteria, but it's like, where you can have the most impact, neglected. I think there's a third one that I'm forgetting. Like that's their framework for figuring out who they should personally help. And like that's a perfectly valid framework. And I think if everyone in the world did it, it would be an excellent framework, because then nothing would be neglected, and it would be a very efficient framework. But the current framework is such that not everyone has it, so we're not at that point, right? So there's that element to this, that if everyone did it, it would be a completely different situation, that you could focus on the people more close to you because they would be just as neglected as everyone else. But there's also just this aspect of like, there isn't one system for deciding who you want to be charitable towards with your time and resources. And I think effective altruism has one good way of approaching that, but I don't think your way is wrong either.
How does the EA community? Oh, sorry, I missed what you said there, Jared.
Just where do we actually disagree? Do we actually disagree? I don't think we do.
Something I was thinking about with that, and also I guess the artistic differences, is it sounds like kind of like a general, like levels of abstraction, right? So like you could have a very abstract algorithm that's stripped of all detail, and then it becomes and that could be generalizable, and then becomes distinct once you start adding in details, different inputs. So like the example again, and of like the Joe Biden sandwiches, like if there were two groups, there might be a universalizable pattern that people follow when making certain judgments, ethical or aesthetic, but then plugging in the details is where it becomes different.
Yeah,
And we've reached an aporia. um, if it's okay to transition to something, do we want to talk more about that one? Or I have another topic that I wanted to bring up, if it's all right.
Yeah, what have you got?
Oh, I was wanting to talk about Neoreaction. Those guys
Perfect.
are crazy.
Yeah. And you might actually be surprised by how related this is to the past topic.
Great. And actually, I read through your write up on was it on Curtis Yarvin?
Yes.
But I didn't follow all of it. But do you want to give like a little recap of it?
Yeah. So basically, he was outlining the argument for Neoreaction and the narrative for it. And I think it's less important to focus on the specific factual claims and more important to focus on the overall narrative. And the reason for this ties exactly into what we were just discussing in terms of finding disagreements, where people disagree, whatever, in that basically it is asking us to take a very different prioritization to what we normally do while looking at basically the same factual landscape. So Neoreaction concludes, I'm starting with some word association. Neoreaction says basically right equals order equals keeping vows equals you want rule of a very strong few, sort of Hobbes's Leviathan and such. And then left is chaos, is breaking vows, is progressivism, is rule of the people, rule of the many, everything. And so then basically the conclusion Neoreaction reaches is that it is good to have very, very strong leadership and centralized leadership. What you want to look at is not necessarily like, oh, is this a democracy, but is this functional? And democracy ends up being relatively non-functional compared to, they would say, like corporate governance or something. And I would say Mormon governance.
Mm-hmm.
What they want is essentially Mormonism, but as the governing government instead of as just a religion. In the sense of, actually, I think it maps onto it brilliantly. I don't know if I made this.
Well, and there was that comparison to the Chinese Communist Party too, right? Where it's kind of a hierarchy where you work your way up with seniority and all that.
Yeah. Yep. But yeah, I think basically neo-reactionaries want Mormons to be in charge of the world is a surprisingly effective way of conveying their way of looking at things.
Curtis Yarvin isn't Mormon, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
And they would
another one. Oh no.
They would not exactly endorse that, other than saying, well, yeah, the Mormons have a functional system, and it does have a leader with absolute power, and it does have a council of people that leader is accountable to, and it does have this, you break it down, and it's like, well, yeah, this is kind of what they're asking for. It is this very order-focused thing. It is this, and so basically they would say the whole progressive narrative is false and wrong and has been leading us down the wrong track. And the narrative that history is progressing, no, people are the same as they always have been. And basically we've been drifting in the wrong direction for years and years and years, and everything we think we know is built on this foundation of ideological lies.
Now, what? So, like, I'm thinking the progressive narrative is wrong. Is that like on the racial issues and sexual liberation, and like what parts of the progressive narrative are considered wrong?
See, that's the funny thing, is like you dive in, and again, details are surprisingly hard. I would say the very clearest one, the one where you'd find pretty much unanimous consensus that progressive narrative is wrong among neo-reactionaries, would be on race and essentialism, where they would basically, and the whole whatever blank slate thing, they would be like, oh yeah, of course, HBD is correct. People have clear genetic differences, and the idea
HBD
of,
is human biodiversity.
Yes.
Got it. Oh, I was just guessing.
Exactly.
All right.
Yep. And they would be like, progressives are completely misled, like structural things like systemic racism and such are not the cause of all sorts of like racial disparities. Those are largely genetic and such. And that would be like one of the examples they would give in terms of the progressive narrative has got this all wrong.
What about feminism? Because I can see that being applied as well.
Yeah. They would be like, yeah, men and women also have differences and such, and those differences aren't inherently bad, and that we are, a lot of things like that. Basically, they would take the opposite position to your local socialist or your local Elizabeth Warren on just about everything.
Yeah. And does eugenics factor in, like that, like being anti-miscegenation and that, or
stuff like that? I mean, yeah. So stuff like that comes up, but they're not like, they're not
central.
They're not super. As much as I said, this is kind of the focus of it. Like, Curtis Yarvin is he's not thrilled about white supremacy overall, and he did his best to distance himself from all this white supremacy stuff, although it inevitably ties in.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's something where they would talk about it and be like, well, here are the effects of it and such, and they wouldn't be afraid to pop in and be like, oh yeah, we think interracial marriage is wrong, this or this. They'd be like, yeah, sure, this is an idea we'll discuss. But I don't know that they'd have a clear consensus.
Have any of you read Mark Lilla's The Shipwrecked Mind?
No.
I'm trying to think of how well it maps on. So it's about reactionary writings. So it's a pretty interesting book. I read it, I think, back in 2016. As I recall, one of the central theses of the book is that what he calls reactionary. So he wasn't addressing neo-reaction. He was talking about reactionary writings. It was kind of hearkening back to a golden age, kind of whether it existed or not, either a golden age in the past or a golden age in the future. So like, for example, he had a chapter on Alain Badiou where he's talking about a golden age in the future, which would be a communist utopia. Or he also talks about like Leo Strauss, so that would be more classical age and even the late medieval to an extent. But is neo-reaction hearkening back to a golden age, or does it not map onto that so much?
It doesn't so much. I mean, he would say, oh yeah, I want to restore the House of Stuart to the throne of England and such. But it's not so much hearkening back to a golden age as saying, basically saying with technology is good and everything. We love technological progress, but technological progress has been the driver of a lot of things that we would identify as clearly good. And socially, we haven't progressed the way we'd like to think we've progressed. Therefore, we need to design from the ground up a better system that mostly involves just getting someone really, really competent in charge and seeing what they do. I would say actually that would be the core, is saying we want someone very, very competent to have absolute power over a region. And they would also say things like, in terms of foreign policy and stuff, they'd say, oh yeah, we want countries to stop meddling, like the US to stop meddling all over in whatever foreign policy. Like if a country wants to do something, that country is sovereign in their territory, let them do whatever. Like we should stop messing around with all that. And basically what a country decides goes. We do our thing, they do their thing. If our things happen to interact, great, but we're not trying to create some global connection of everything. Like each country minds its own business and we run ours the best we possibly can, or each region even runs its own business the best it possibly can. A lot of things like that, basically.
That core idea is not something that I find hugely objectionable, even though I don't say I would adhere to it. But I guess more of those details, maybe they're ancillary, but contra the progressive views, I don't, I'm not a fan of that at all. But yeah, I mean, I guess the idea of centralized authority, I mean, that's definitely a respectable position. I remember when I was in high school, that was like, in speech and debate, that was one of the big topics one year, is like decentralization versus centralization. And that's basically the topic of the Constitutional Convention and the Federalist Papers and all of that. Nothing too crazy about that. And there's debates to be had there. But, is Neoreaction how influential is it? It's just like is it like destined to the fringes, you think, or?
So it's certainly a fringe ideology, but it's the sort of thing that has a degree of staying power and has a way of slowly creeping into mainstream-ish side stream thought. Like, so that original link where I believe you posted the original link to a piece by Curtis Yarvin in the American Mind.
I did.
And, yes, and it is gaining a presence within like the rightish, intellectualish circles, where you see it's the sort of thing where, because it has a lot of fairly clear ideas and a few influential mouthpieces pushing them, it's the sort of thing where suddenly you'll see a bunch of seemingly unrelated people pushing a bunch of seemingly unrelated ideas, where eventually you trace it back to the root and you're like, oh, at this root, this is a neo-reactionary idea.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of influence I would say it's getting.
And I guess I'm kind of fascinated about it, even though it's not like a personal attraction that I would really want to buy into. But I guess I'm fascinated by it. I think in the broader trend of that thing I was talking about, how books that shape people by the time they're 20, or I would say 30, but you remember that, or Jared corrected it to people, which I think is probably a decent correction. That, I don't know, there seems to be kind of like these cults of personality, or things that people can get really passionate about, especially if there seems to be like a lot of talent, clear intelligence there. So this guy Curtis Yarvin seems to be a pretty intelligent guy. And then any of, so like Nietzsche, I could see have a cult following, certainly. Marx, Jordan Peterson, all of those guys, and positives and negatives to all of that. I think any of those type of things that just sweep people up are interesting to me.
Yes.
And I recognize, I guess, the potentially negative possibilities there. Maybe I guess what I worry about is tunnel vision, I guess is the best way I could think of describing it. It's just like, you get so dedicated to it. Kind of like, I bring up like the objectivists with Ayn Rand. Like any criticism of Ayn Rand is like just pounced on, not considering like, oh, maybe she wasn't right about everything, or,
right.
I'm influenced by Ayn Rand, but she's not like the gospel to me. And I find it interesting, I guess, a little bit for that. It's interest and a little bit of a morbid fascination.
Yes. I think the most useful role I can see for neo-reactionaries is as the devil's advocate against democracy, in that they are very motivated to look through a very, very different lens at the same stories that the rest of us see and dig up a very different story out of it. And I think it is critical to have that in terms of examining our blind spots. That's the most value I've personally seen from them.
Well, and I like to think, so I consider myself a Democrat in the broad sense of like being in favor of democracy, but I think it's always good to look at the criticisms of ideas as a way to fashion them. I can find that I can find that very useful. What do you think, Jared?
Well, I know very little about neo-reactionary.
Oh, okay.
That some people that are involved in that in some capacity, either just like maybe either neo-reactionaries or neo-reactionary adjacent, kind of spill over into the effective altruism and rationalist communities.
I've had a sense of that. You said effective altruism and rationalists. Yeah. I've had a sense of that, and I guess I've tended to conflate them, but there is some overlap, right?
There's some overlap, but for me,
largely coincidental overlap. But yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's a small overlap.
Okay.
But it's always an uncomfortable overlap for me because I very much do not adhere to any neo-reactionary philosophy. And when these people appear in the communities you're involved in, it always makes you a little bit uncomfortable. They're like, so the neo-reactionary approach to effective altruism is much more ordinary people would find it morally abhorrent.
Yeah.
And I often do as well.
What is the neo-reactionary approach to effective altruism? I haven't seen that particular junction.
Yeah, there was a specific Facebook group. It was called something like Dark Effective Altruism or something like that.
Dark altruism?
Dark Effective Altruism. I can't remember.
That sounds about right, yeah.
Oh, gosh. I'm going to mock that, sorry. Yeah, it's mockable.
The group was built on the idea of criticizing effective altruism, but it ended up being overtaken by sort of right-wing ideologues, I would say. Maybe ideologues is too strong a term, but certainly a lot of the people there were more right-wing. So specifically Rocco's Basilisk was one of your contributors of that, who is just an interesting character. I do not like him very much. And I eventually had to leave the group because I was like, I do not want to be a part of this group.
Right.
Random thought. So you mentioned how like normal people, the normies, would find a certain idea like objectionable, right? Would be, appalling. So for me, that's like, I find that useful, right? It's a bit of a reality check. So I was talking about the tunnel vision earlier, right? If somebody who's not like totally embedded in a niche worldview looks at something and they're like, what the heck is like, that is weird. Not necessarily that I would say, okay, you're right. Oh, I've been totally going down the wrong track here, but at least it's a signal to me to like give it some thought. I don't know. Does that make sense? Do you think that is a fair heuristic?
It's a solid heuristic. I would say, yeah, sometimes I don't know that it's always something I would do. And I don't think you were saying that, but I think it's useful to step back and be like, okay, do normal people are normal people suddenly horrified and flinching away?
Yeah.
Am I scaring all the normies? Okay,
Right.
Probably examine this carefully.
Mm-hmm. The whole terminology of normie is very amusing to me anyway. But
it's quite the word.
Yeah.
Like of altruism and rationalist movements or communities, I'd say normie has the added connotation of not having autism.
Oh. Yes. Oh, so it's like paired with Aspie?
Yeah, because such a large portion of the people in those communities are autistic.
Oh, okay.
And even the people who aren't autistic kind of seem like they might be, or at least like yes. Me, that I'm slightly like I'm well. There's a few things that I occasionally wonder, like, am I autistic? I'm like, I'm not. But there's a few things that, like, if someone asked me if I was, I'd be like, that's a reasonable question to ask.
Okay, yeah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So just so you know, we're coming up on 2 minutes here. Actually, my daughter has a swim lesson coming up. Are we okay wrapping it up here? Or was there any more? I could probably buy a few more minutes of time if we wanted to go into another session.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have some where you're headed and everything, I think this is a natural enough endpoint. I mean, conversations like this, you could go on.
You could go on forever, right? So yeah, maybe we could just pick it up next time. Yeah, we don't have to go for hours and hours each time. All right. Well, sounds good. So Jared, I will. I'll pick up. Oh, do you have a truck or anything to carry kayaks?
We have. Let's talk offline.
We'll talk offline about that. We don't have to figure it all out for the audience here, but okay, it sounds good. All right. Well, thank you very much, and I'll talk to you guys later. And I'll try to put these two together and get them up soon.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
All right. I'll see you later tonight, Jared, and I'll talk to you later, Jack.
Take care.
You too.